Silas stepped onto his porch in the early light of a May morning in 1816, and the first thing he noticed was the silence. It was a heavy, unnatural stillness that hung over the Vermont hills. When he breathed, a white plume of frost escaped his lips, despite it being well past the season for snow. He looked down at the garden beds, and his heart sank. The young corn shoots, which had only just begun to push through the dark soil, were coated in a brittle silver skin of ice. They were not just frozen, they were dead. He walked toward the village of Montpelier, hoping to find an explanation. As he moved, he saw other farmers standing by their fences, their faces etched with a deep, quiet confusion. There was no talk of a sudden storm or a passing winter gale. Instead, there was only a sense of profound wrongness. The sun was a pale, sickly disk behind a permanent veil of grey clouds that refused to break. It provided no warmth, only a dim, ghostly light that made the world look like an old, fading photograph. In the local tavern, the men spoke in low voices about the strange weather. Some whispered that the world was ending, while others blamed the strange, dry winds coming from the north. No one in the valley could have known that the cause was not in their mountains, but thousands of miles away across a vast and silent ocean. To Silas, it simply felt as though the spring had been stolen from him, leaving behind a world that had forgotten how to be warm. Thousands of miles away, on the island of Sumbawa in the Indonesian archipelago, the world was a different shade of green. In the early months of 1815, the air was thick, sweet, and heavy with tropical humidity. The island was a lush tapestry of rainforests and coastal villages, all of it dominated by the massive, looming presence of Mount Tambora. To the people living in its shadow, the mountain was a permanent part of the landscape, as steady and reliable as the tides. Tambora sat in a state of deceptive peace. It was a massive stratovolcano, a giant of stone and earth that rose high above the surrounding jungle. The local kingdoms thrived in its presence, trading spices and grains under the watchful eye of the peak. There were no tremors to speak of, and no sulphurous smells to warn the villagers of the power sleeping beneath their feet. The mountain seemed to be resting, a silent guardian of the island. But deep beneath the surface, the earth was restless. Magma was pushing upward, filling vast chambers of rock with immense crushing pressure. The heat was building, unseen and unheard by the people below. The very foundations of the island were beginning to strain under the weight of a geological tension that had been brewing for centuries. The mountain was not merely sitting there, it was breathing, gathering a colossal strength that would soon demand to be released. The peace of April 1815 did not break, it shattered. The eruption of Mount Tambora began with a sound so violent that it defied human description. It was a sonic boom of such magnitude that it was heard hundreds of miles away across the sea, echoing through the islands like the cracking of the world itself. It was not merely a noise, it was a physical blow that shook the very air. Within minutes, the sky over Sumbawa vanished. A colossal column of ash and pulverized rock tore upward, punching through the clouds and reaching high into the stratosphere. It looked like a dark, terrifying pillar rising from the earth to touch the heavens. The sun was instantly blotted out, replaced by a churning, blackened void. The midday light died, replaced by a terrifying artificial night that smelled of burnt stone and brimstone. As the mountain's summit collapsed under its own weight, the destruction was absolute. The local kingdoms, once vibrant and full of life, were swallowed by pyroclastic flows, which were rivers of superheated gas and ash that raced down the slopes at incredible speeds. There was no time to run, no way to hide. In a single catastrophic moment, the landscape was rewritten. The mountain that had been a silent giant was now a hollowed, smoking ruin, and the debris from its fury was already beginning its long, dark journey into the upper atmosphere. High above the reach of any bird or storm cloud, a new and invisible layer began to settle over the planet. The eruption of Tambora had not just thrown rock and ash into the sky. It had injected a staggering amount of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere. This gas did not simply fall back to Earth like common dust. Instead, it reacted with the moisture in the upper atmosphere to form tiny, microscopic droplets of sulfuric acid. These aerosols created a fine, shimmering veil that stretched across the vastness of the oceans and the continents alike. This veil acted like a mirror held up to the heavens. As the sunlight traveled from the sun toward the earth, it struck this layer of sulfur and scattered. The bright, direct rays that once warmed the fields and fed the forests were suddenly deflected back into space. The world did not turn pitch black, but the light changed in a way that felt deeply unnatural. The sun lost its golden brilliance. Instead, it became a pale, sickly disk. On many days, the light took on a dim, bruised red hue, as if the sky itself were perpetually caught in the moments before a sunset. The aerosol veil moved with the great winds of the high atmosphere, circling the globe in a relentless, silent march. It moved over the Pacific, over the vast reaches of the Atlantic, and eventually over the mountains of Europe. It was a shroud that no one could see, yet everyone would feel. It was a chemical curtain that sat between the earth and its lifeblood, quietly beginning to starve the world of its heat. By the time the seasons began to turn in 1816, the warmth of the sun had become a memory. The temperature across the northern hemisphere did not just dip, it plummeted. In places where summer was supposed to be a time of growth and heat, a biting, unnatural cold took hold. The air felt thin and hollow, lacking the heavy warmth that farmers relied upon to coax life from the soil. In the fertile plains of Europe, the catastrophe took a physical form in the fields. The wheat crops, which should have been heavy and golden under a summer sun, simply failed to thrive. The growing season was stunted by frost that arrived in the middle of July and stayed well into August. A farmer might look out at his fields and see not the vibrant green of life, but the grey, withered stalks of a harvest that would never come. The soil remained cold, the sun remained dim, and the plants could not find the energy to grow. This was the beginning of a global collapse. As the wheat withered, the grain stores began to empty. The sudden drop in temperature meant that the very rhythm of the earth had been broken. What followed was not merely a bad season, but the onset of a great famine. The failure of the crops sent a ripple of hunger through every village and every town. The chill was not just in the air, it was settling into the very bones of the people, as they realized that the warmth they took for granted might not return for a very long time. Hunger has a way of stripping away the thin veneer of civilization. As the grain stores vanished and the price of a single loaf of bread climbed beyond the reach of a working man, the quiet desperation of the countryside turned into a roar in the cities. In London and Paris, the streets were no longer places of commerce and community, but theatres of survival. The price of grain rose with a terrifying speed. A labourer who had once been able to provide for a family found himself staring at empty cupboards, his wages rendered worthless by the skyrocketing cost of flour. When the belly is empty, the fear of the law begins to fade. In the narrow alleys of the great cities, the first bread riots began to break out. It started with small groups of women, driven by the sight of hungry children, but it quickly swelled into something much more volatile. Crowds gathered in the squares, their voices rising in a desperate, angry chorus. They demanded food, they demanded justice, and they demanded that the authorities do something to stop the starvation. The working class, stripped of their dignity and their means of survival, found themselves pushed to the edge of madness. Protests turned into clashes with the guards, and the smoke from small fires began to drift through the darkened streets. The gloom of the volcanic winter had settled over the world, and in that darkness, the social order began to fracture under the weight of a billion hungry sighs. Hunger is a restless thing. It does not sit still in a dark room, waiting for the end. Instead, it pushes people outward, driving them across hills and oceans in a desperate search for a life that is not defined by scarcity. In the years following the eruption, the very map of the world began to blur. In Europe, the old village structures, which had held families together for centuries, began to crumble. When the soil failed, the social contract failed with it. People abandoned their ancestral homes, leaving behind empty cottages and quiet churches, moving toward the cities or toward the coast in hopes of finding work or mercy. Across the Atlantic, this movement took on a different, more permanent shape. In the United States, the failed harvests in New England acted as a heavy hand, pushing families away from the rocky, frozen soil of the East. They looked toward the west, toward the Ohio River Valley and the lands beyond, seeking a place where the sun might still reach the earth. It was a migration born of necessity rather than ambition. These were not explorers seeking gold, but parents seeking grain. They moved in long, weary lines, carrying what little they owned, driven by the knowledge that to stay was to perish. This massive shift of people would eventually reshape the American landscape, turning frontier territories into settled states. The borders of nations were not just being drawn by politicians with pens, but by millions of feet treading through the mud, fleeing a shadow they could neither see nor understand. While much of the world struggled to find bread, a different kind of energy was gathering in the shadow of the Alps. In the summer of 1816, the weather at Lake Geneva was not merely cold, it was oppressive. The sky remained a bruised, heavy grey, and the rain fell with a relentless rhythmic persistence. A group of travellers, including the poet Lord Byron and the young Mary Shelley, found themselves trapped indoors by the gloom. They had gathered for a summer of lively conversation, but the volcanic veil had turned their retreat into a cage of mist and shadow. To pass the long, dark hours, Byron proposed a contest. Each person was to write a ghost story, a tale to match the eerie atmosphere outside their windows. It was in this stifling, rain-soaked environment that Mary Shelley began to dream. She sat by the fire, watching the lightning flicker through the gloom, and began to conceive of a creature brought to life by science, a monster born of isolation and lightning. The result was Frankenstein, a novel that would change the face of literature forever. The gloom of the volcanic winter did more than starve crops, it fed the imagination. The dark, Gothic tones of the era were not merely a stylistic choice, they were a reflection of the world itself. The sulphurous skies and the endless rain provided a canvas for a new kind of horror, one that explored the terror of the unknown and the fragility of life in a world that had suddenly turned cold and strange. Time, eventually, began to move forward again. By 1817, the heavy, suffocating shroud of sulphur began to thin. The sun, which had been a pale and sickly thing for so long, started to regain its strength. The skies, once a constant, hazy grey, began to show hints of true blue. The global temperatures began their long, slow climb back toward what people remembered as normal. The ash was settling, falling into the oceans and the deep valleys, leaving the atmosphere to clear one breath at a time. But the world that emerged from the darkness was not the same world that had entered it. The scars were etched deep into the bones of society. The global economy had been shaken to its core, with debts unpaid and entire industries of agriculture left in ruins. The famine had left a legacy of poverty that would take generations to heal. The migrations had already begun to shift the demographics of continents, and the social unrest had taught the ruling classes a new, permanent fear of the hungry masses. Even as the warmth returned to the fields, the memory of the cold remained. People looked at the sky with a new kind of caution, knowing now how quickly the sun could be stolen away. The volcano had passed, its fire extinguished, but it had left behind a world that had learned, through bitter experience, just how fragile the balance of life truly is. Silas stands at the edge of his field in Vermont, the morning sun warming the back of his neck. It is a true sun, a heavy and honest heat that feels earned after the years of biting frost and the endless weeping grey of the previous seasons. He reaches down, his fingers brushing the soil. It is dark, rich, and finally, predictably warm. The corn stalks are rising, strong and green, pushing through the earth without the fear of a sudden, killing freeze. He remembers the year the summer died. He remembers the way the frost bit into the tender buds in June, and the way the light seemed to lose its strength, as if the very sky had grown tired. He did not know then that a mountain thousands of miles away, across an ocean he would never see, was the architect of his misery. He did not know that the sulphurous veil choking his lungs was a ghost sent from the heart of Indonesia. The world has moved on. The hungry crowds in the cities have found their bread, and the travelers have settled into new homes in distant lands. The great geological engine of the earth has finished its violent work, leaving only the quiet peace of a world that has learned to be cautious. Silas looks up at the blue expanse, feeling a strange, quiet weight in his chest. He realizes now that we are all merely guests of the earth. We build our lives, we plant our seeds, and we plan our futures, all while resting on the skin of a giant that can, with one single breath, change the fate of every soul alive.